This is my amp rack. I hate it. It has got to go. Here's the backstory. Last year I pulled the back seat out of my truck. The plan was to create a rolling test bench where I could swap out subwoofers to review them here on the channel. But I made a massive mistake. The amp rack was just too wide. Here's an example of what I mean. This quad box right here that I built for these Savard subwoofers barely fit. This amp rack takes up over a third of my available space, so I can't do large builds like 412s or a pair of 18s. So like I said before, it's got to go. Here's the new plan. All of the gear, 3 amplifiers, the DSP, the fuse blocks, the distribution blocks, the wiring, all of that's got to move down to the floorboard. And that's where I ran into a huge problem. Since the truck is going to be a rolling test bench, I need to make sure I can easily swap out all of that gear and easily reach all of the settings on all the amplifiers. The fuse blocks also need to be within easy reach so I can swap out fuses as needed. And I've got to keep all the gear beneath the top of my platform so that I can slide subwoofer boxes in and out without scratching up and ruining the amplifiers. All those restrictions means I can't put stuff underneath the seats. And it turns out I don't have enough room for 3 amps, a DSP, and all of these fuse blocks and stuff on the back floorboard. One solution is to get rid of one of the amps, but I do need 8 channels for a 3-way front stage with rear fill. So I started looking at 8-channel amplifiers, and 8-channel amplifiers are expensive. But then I got very lucky. I was able to find an XD800/8 scratch and dent discount. So I got a deal on this amp, and I'll be sure to give you a link down below where you can find a good deal on scratch and dent gear yourself. JL Audio doesn't make cheap stuff, and even with that discount, this 8-channel amp is still a whole lot more expensive than a pair of JP84s. So if your goal is to save money, this isn't a good strategy, but there are some extra advantages to using an 8-channel amp. More on those later, so keep watching. Okay, all the old gear is out and it's time to build that amp rack. The first thing you're going to want to do is grab a combination square and take some measurements. I need to know the distance from the platform to the top of that transmission hump in the center of the truck, and the distance from the platform to the floorboard. One interesting feature of this truck, it came with some cup holders in the back seat area. The mount for the plastic cup holders is permanently welded to the truck. That cup holder assembly juts out a few inches and the amp rack will need to fit around it. It's just under about 11 inches wide. I've got about 2 feet of clearance on the passenger side and about 1 foot of clearance on the driver's side before I come into contact with the battery. So the idea is to use this piece of black ABS to make a flat amp rack that's even with the top of that center transmission hump, and then mount the DSP on a shelf in the rear passenger footwell with the JP23 right in the middle and the 8-channel amp sitting above the DSP over on the passenger side. I got this ABS from Amazon. Like always, I'll be sure to give you a link to everything used in the video down in the video description. By cutting a piece down, this piece is slightly oversized. The plan here is to test fit the piece and remove material as needed. The next step is to cut a groove. I've got my blade lowered on my table saw so it's just barely sticking out of the top of the saw. This groove is going to come in handy in a little bit when we're ready to bend the material with a heat gun. And of course, I will need to take some measurement and cut a notch to get around that stupid cup holder in the back of the truck. After I've got it all marked out, I'm going to rough cut it with a jigsaw before taking it over to the router so I can flush trim it with a flush trim bit. Which you can't see because my arm's in the shot. This leaves me with 2 tabs that I need to bend to a 90-degree angle. To do that, you're going to want a decent heat gun and some thick gloves. After I got those tabs bent, I realized that I didn't make a big enough notch for the cup holder, so I cut out that notch off camera, and then it's over to the truck for a test fit. And then back over to the router table for a little bit of trimming, and then another test fit. I'm running into 2 problems. First of all, the amp rack itself is a little bit too long on the driver's side, and over on the passenger side, it's interfering with the B-pillar. So I'm going to trim off some more material on that side. That 90-degree bend I put in the ABS earlier, that's going to be my mounting point. I'm just going to screw that to the platform. After double checking the measurements, those are a little bit too tall, so I've got to trim them down on the table saw. This is not a particularly safe cut. These gripper push blocks come in really handy in cuts like this. Now I need to build that shelf for the DSP. That shelf has a dual purpose. One, it holds the DSP, and two, it's going to provide support underneath the JL Audio amplifier so the amp rack doesn't sag. I also need to add a brace on the other side for the same purpose. Here's a little preview of the DSP shelf. To build that shelf, I'm using some multi-purpose plastic cement that can be used to glue PVC to ABS plus some wood screws. The legs themselves are going to be made out of PVC sheet. I ran into yet another big problem. I don't have enough clearance in that shelf to install the DSP. I probably burned a good hour, maybe two of my life struggling with a right angle bit before I thought of a better solution. I just drilled 4 holes in the top shelf to get access to the mounting tabs on the DSP. It was still a bit of a pain to get to those screws, but it went from being impossible to being just a pain in the rear, and that's a whole lot better. Every time I build an amp rack, I try to do a better job than the last. I want to make the wiring as clean as possible. To do that, I need to space out those zip ties evenly. So I grabbed some acrylic and head over to the laser and I cut out this template right here. This is going to allow me to drill some evenly spaced holes in the top of the amp rack so that all my zip ties are spaced perfectly. Here I'm installing a terminal block on that DSP shelf. This is an interesting terminal block. It came with these jumpers. With the jumper installed, all of the connections are all paralleled together. The plan here is to use this to turn on the amplifiers. The DSP has a turn on input that comes from your head unit and a turn on output that goes to your amplifiers. You can jump into the software and add a delay to avoid thumps when you turn and turn off your system. What I'm going to do here is run that turn on signal from the DSP to this terminal block and then from there out to the amplifiers. And here we see one of the advantages to using an 8-channel amplifier. On the previous amp rack, I was using the DSP to activate a relay, and the relay was used to turn on the amplifiers. This DSP has plenty of current to turn on 2 amplifiers, so there's no need for that relay. And that means one less part to buy, wire up, and install. It doesn't save a ton of money, but it does save a ton of time, and it does save a ton of space, both of which are at a premium in this build. Here I'm using my drill to twist together some black and green wire. This is going to be the power and ground wire for the DSP. I also need 2 runs of blue primary wire. Both of these will connect to the terminal strip that I was just talking about. One's going to run to the JP23 and one's going to run to the JL. That blue wire will turn on the amplifiers. Since I've got all the wires for the DSP in place, now's a good time to wire up the DSP connections. There's a plug in the back. The power, the ground, the remote turn on input, and the remote turn on output all plug into that connector. So right now I'm going to wire everything except for the remote in. I'm going to make that connection when I install the amp rack in the truck. And no, I'm not using a fork terminal for these. It's not really necessary. Moving over to the area right behind the driver's seat, this is where I'm going to mount the fuses. I'm installing a pair of A&L fuse blocks. One's going to be lined up with the positive terminal on the JP. That one's going to get a 300 amp fuse. Just like on the previous amp rack, the JP23 gets its own dedicated run of 0 gauge wire. It needs that wire to handle all the current that thing's going to draw. The other fuse block is for the JL Audio amplifier. It's going to hold an 80 amp fuse. This is another advantage of using a single 8-channel amplifier. On the old amp rack, I had a ground distribution block and a fuse distribution block to split some 0 gauge wire down into 4 gauge wire to run to the twin 4-channel amplifiers. Now I just need a single run of 4 gauge wire and a single fuse for the JL Audio amp. I'm going to go ahead and mount this accessory fuse block right here. The only thing that it's going to power is the DSP, but it has plenty of spots on it if I want to add some other circuits later. With the fuse blocks installed, it's time to mount and connect the amplifiers. I'm using a center punch to mark out the drill holes. Normally I just grab a drill and go to town, but since this JL amp is kind of expensive, I'm trying to be a little more careful than normal. Okay, with the amplifiers mounted, I'm now going to install the ground wire for the JP23. This wire is going to run directly to the battery, which is going to be located right behind the driver's seat. It doesn't have to be a very long piece of wire. Now I'm going to go ahead and make the connections at the JL amp, and I found something interesting. The JL amp has square terminals. That's a little different. I've never seen that before. The DSP I'm using is a 6-in 12-out DSP, so it's got plenty of channels for this setup. I'm using 4 pairs of 2-channel RCAs to run signal up to the 8-channel amp, and then a single pair of RCAs over to the JP23. With those RCAs zip tied out of the way, it looks like the amp rack is done, but we're not. I've still got to install it in the truck. I can't quite do that yet because I've got a few more upgrades planned for the truck, and I'll install the amp rack when I take care of those upgrades. In the meantime, check out this video right here. Before I go, I want to say thank you to all of my patrons with a bonus shout out to $25 and up patrons: Johnny, Timothy, Paul, David, JD America, Bo, Dylan, and Jonathan. I'm Justin. This is the DIY Audio Guy YouTube channel, and I will see you on the next adventure.